Hi, good evening, Facebook friends, revolutionaries, citizens of America and the planet. Welcome to tonight's edition of the Fireside Chat. And you'll notice it's not nighttime here. We're coming to you from South Korea. I'm on the road with the peace delegation, which is an amazing group of activists and organizers who've been doing a lifetime of work in the areas of peace, in social, economic, and racial justice, in environmental justice, and all this work comes together. It's been really exciting to see how our various perspectives are so synergistic. It's also really interesting to see how all of these issues are playing out right now on the Korean Peninsula. And just to be really brief about that, Korea has basically been, in one way or another, occupied territory, now occupied by the U.S. military south of the 38th parallel. In one form or another, it's been a battlefield of the great powers ever since the early 1900s, when the Japanese invaded and had a very brutal occupation for decades that ran into the Second World War, and then almost immediately after the Second World War, Korea was divided by, again, warring foreign powers. There has never been a peace treaty. Korea has remained essentially in a state of war, with the United States Defense Forces controlling the South Korean military, and with about 40,000 U.S. troops, and now missile bases as well. And as you may know, there's a real nuclear confrontation going on right now on the Korean Peninsula, as well as a military confrontation with the U.S. having pivoted our military forces to Asia, beginning under the Obama administration. So we all have a stake in what's going on there, if for no other reason than if conflict is allowed to continue the way it's going, we are headed for potential nuclear catastrophe, which impacts us all. Even a small nuclear exchange is devastating to the whole world and would create what's called nuclear winter, where food production is massively reduced because of all the debris that's unleashed. Basically, things get clouded over for years and agricultural production goes way down. So whether you care about the human rights issues here, the democracy issues, the issues of labor and economic and social and racial justice and gender justice, it all comes back, whether you like it or not. We're connected. We're on one small boat here, and that boat right now is what's going on the Korean Peninsula. So with that, let me just quickly tell you who's on this delegation, and then we'll turn the camera over to each of them. We're in the car now, you probably noticed. We are driving from the location of the missile installation that is a missile so-called defense system. It's actually not missile defense, so I don't like to use that term. I call it a destabilizing missile system, which is actually what it is. It doesn't defend. It is not capable of actually defense under real-world conditions. It's a destabilizing missile system which has been placed to the south of Seoul, Korea, a city of 25 million people, which is essentially in the target hairs right now. We're coming from the community where that missile system was placed and where the community is fighting back. And the whole country actually is fighting back. And it's been unbelievably exciting to see how organized and mobilized people are around the state, but especially around the country, but especially in the area of Songju and Gimcheon, which are the communities where the missile is located. That missile system is called THAAD, and we will be referring to that throughout the broadcast. So we have on this delegation a wonderful cross-section of movements and networks. So Medea Benjamin, I think everybody knows Medea's amazing work as a irrepressible, tireless voice for peace. And Medea's with Code Pink, one of the co-founders. We'll hear from Medea. We'll hear from Will Griffin, who is an organizer on the board of Veterans for Peace. And we're going to hear from Reese Chenault, who is an organizer with U.S. Labor Against the War. And so exciting to hear so loud and clear the voice of labor taking a really compelling position against the war and against militarism and imperialism and occupation that goes with our current foreign policy. And then finally we'll hear from Wolsan Lame, if I'm saying that correctly?
Yes.
Yes, okay, good. And Wolsan is our host. Wolsan is a Korean American and is connected to many networks, but in particular here in Korea, South Korea, she is the international point person for the Korean Public Service and Transportation Workers Union, which is, I believe it is the biggest component of their of the Korean Confederation of unions, called the Korean Confederation of Trade Unions. Okay, great. And she'll tell you more about that, as well as her perspective and her take on what's going on here. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to our first speaker, and I encourage you to please like this conversation, share this conversation so we can get the word out that there is another way forward for democracy, for justice, for human rights, and for peace. All of those issues are converging here on the Korean Peninsula, and what we do on the Korean Peninsula is really a defining moment, and it really establishes what we can do going forward. We have to work this conflict out if we're going to live into another decade. So it's a really great time for us to be working together. Like this, share this, get the word out, and post your questions and your comments. We'll be turning to them after our introductions. So I'm going to pass this over now to Will, along with, let's see, that should go in.
Yeah.
Okay.
That was fine. That's fine.
Okay, great.
All right. Hello. My name's Will Griffin. I am one of the delegate members on this delegation that is titled U.S. Solidarity Peace Delegation. That has Medea Benjamin from Code Pink, Reese Chenault from U.S. Labor Against the War, Jill Stein, of course, from the Green Party, and me representing Veterans for Peace. But there is also one more member that we are missing that was denied entry into the country. So the South Korean government has banned her from entering the country because they realize how important our goals are of this delegation. Her name is Ju-Yeon Ri. We've sent hundreds of emails to the South Koreans' Blue House, which is like the U.S. White House, but they still have yet to lift the ban. So there should be 5 delegates on this team, but there are only 4 here now. And our delegation has 3 main goals. Our first and the most immediate and important right now is to remove the THAAD anti-missile system from South Korea that was illegally and immorally deployed to the county of Songju, which is right about in the middle of the South Korean country, which is highly controversial, dangerous, and provocative. So this missile system is supposed to shoot down any incoming missile systems, but these so-called missile defense systems are highly destabilizing. So we call for the immediate removal of this system. The second thing is we want the U.S. and the South Korean government to end their annual war games that they do every single year on the Korean Peninsula. And these training exercises are some of the world's largest military training exercises that go on. And it happens every single year. The third thing is to have all governments that are involved in the Korean Peninsula, U.S., South Korea, North Korea, China, to engage in diplomacy rather than building up our military forces like this THAAD missile defense system or the annual war games that's going on. And a little bit about myself. Again, my name is Will Griffin. I'm on the board of directors of two organizations. One is Veterans for Peace. I hope you've heard of them. Another one is the Global Network Against Weapons and Nuclear Power in Space. You can look them up by Googling space, the number 4 peace, space 4 peace. And this delegation was also organized by the STIC Task Force. STIC is an acronym for Stop THAAD in Korea. You can check them out at stopthaad.org. THAAD is spelled T-H-A-A-D. T-H-A-A-D. Stopthaad.org. But so far, we've had a really great delegation here, and I think we're bringing more attention on how controversial this THAAD anti-missile system is. The residents on the ground don't want it. Many South Koreans don't want it. We're trying to get Americans to realize that this is highly provocative, and it actually has been proven that this system won't be protecting the South Korean people. But I don't want to waste too much time because we have other members on the team.
I want to ask Will to just say a quick word about your background as a veteran and how you came to be active at Veterans for Peace.
Oh yeah, okay. So I am a veteran of the Iraq and Afghanistan wars. I was a paratrooper in the U.S. Army. I was in Iraq 10 years ago, and I was in Afghanistan 8 years ago. And I'm now an anti-war organizer. Like I said, I'm on the board of directors of Veterans for Peace and the Global Network. And my main focus is fighting empire, fighting imperialism. I've also created an online news source called The Peace Report, and which focuses on fighting empire. And my affiliation with South Korea is that I'm half Korean, and I actually lived in South Korea for 4 years when I was a kid because both my parents were in the military, U.S. military. And my father was obviously stationed here in South Korea, and we lived right outside of a huge base called Camp Humphreys in the city of Pyeongtaek for 4 years. And I've been to Korea several times since then, especially in the past year and a half, working on these issues, these anti-war issues, peace issues. So yeah, I'm very much involved in these things.
Great, awesome. Thank you so much, Will. And I'm going to pass this over to Medea Benjamin, who needs no introduction to our audience. Medea has been doing just unbelievably courageous work, I think her whole lifetime, for peace and justice, particularly from a women's-led perspective. And Medea's been here several times before. Maybe she'll also tell us briefly about those experiences, including crossing the DMZ, the militarized, so-called demilitarized zone. Take it away, Medea. Thank you.
Hello, thank you, Jill, and it's been great being on this delegation. I learn so much every time I come here, and I particularly get inspired by the level of energy and enthusiasm and determination of the Korean people. I was here back in 2007 during a struggle to stop the U.S. from expanding its base to a small farming village called Pyeongtaek, where the villagers had been waging an incredible struggle to try to save their village. And in that case, the U.S. military wanted the land because they also wanted to put in a golf course for the military. And so it was worth taking the homes that had been there for generations of these South Korean villagers in order to build a golf course for the U.S. military. The next time I came here was more recently in 2015 with a group of 30 international women on a delegation called Women Cross the DMZ, where we started out in North Korea and crossed the misnamed demilitarized zone because it's the most militarized zone in the world, into South Korea. And it was quite an experience, and recognized the yearning for peace on people from both sides of the border. And now it's so interesting to be here when the Korean people in the South have had an uprising and gotten out the last repressive government of President Park, and through a people's uprising called the Candlelight Uprising, have a new president in place, President Moon, who came to power with the commitment for promoting peace in the peninsula. And so now you have a configuration where President Moon in the south, as well as in the north, the government there and the Chinese government have all called for a peace treaty. Since the 1953 armistice after the Korean War, there was supposed to be a peace treaty several months afterwards. Well, now we're many, many, many decades beyond that, and there still hasn't been a peace treaty. So it's time for one. And now we have President Trump, which makes it more complicated, because on the one hand, you have had Trump saying that he is willing to engage in a dialogue with North Korea, but in reality has just strengthened the sanctions against North Korea, and also this week is going to be calling for an end to U.S. travel to North Korea. This comes on the heels of the tragedy of the American Adam Warmbier being a tourist who came back from North Korea in a coma and died. But I don't think the result of that tragedy should be cutting off relations and further making it difficult to engage in peace talks, but rather a better tribute to him would be just the opposite. So I would say that the reason that we're here and the struggle of the villagers is part of this larger struggle to say that it's time to come to a dialogue and negotiations in the Korean Peninsula. In the meantime, the THAAD missile system, as Will just explained, is something that is increasing tensions. It's part of the old regime in South Korea that accepted this. It is not physically proven that it could protect South Koreans from a North Korean missile. It also has tremendously antagonized the Chinese, and we've learned since we've been here that the Chinese have engaged in economic retaliation against the company that gave its land to the THAAD missile, to the U.S. military to deploy the missile system, one of the large conglomerates in South Korea called Lotte, L-O-T-T-E, but it has also stopped group tourism from China coming to South Korea, which is an important source of income for many people in South Korea. So that is just one more reason for people in South Korea to oppose the THAAD missile system here. And so I think it's important that when we go home, we educate more Americans. I would venture to say that 95% of the people have never heard of THAAD, so first of all, we've got to explain what this weapon system is. And second of all, put it in this context of the incredible militarization and waste of resources in our own country at a time when Donald Trump is calling for a 10% increase in the already bloated military budget, which would then take 60% of our discretionary funds and give it to the Pentagon to create systems like the THAAD missile system that costs billions of dollars and provokes more destabilization in the region. So we're anxious to go home and look forward to working with you to educate Americans about why we should be in solidarity with the people in South Korea. We've learned that there are 83 military bases in this small country, and now with THAAD that would be 84. This country is about a fifth of the size of California. In fact, it could fit between San Francisco and Los Angeles, and imagine having now 84 U.S. military bases there. So it's time to de-escalate, it's time for a peace treaty, and we look forward to working on this on our return. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Medea. We're going to hear now from Reese Chenault with U.S. Labor Against the War, who has just really a critical contribution that has not been heard well. The voice of the labor movement has not been heard enough of over the last many years in the peace movement. I'd say the voice of everybody in the peace movement has been somewhat missing in action for the past decade or so under Obama, when the peace movement kind of went to sleep. So we're going to hear something from Reese in a moment, and in the meantime, let me encourage you please to like, share, and post your questions and your comments. So here we go. I'm going to pass this over.
Hello, my name is Reese Chenault, and I work for U.S. Labor Against the War. We are an organization made up of 150 labor organizations, and our mission is really about demilitarizing foreign policy and making it possible for the labor movement to help move foreign policy within our own movement structure more to the left. So for me, this trip has really been twofold. The first is trying to satisfy a thirst within our organization to directly relate to the struggles of folks abroad and to express our solidarity with folks who are struggling to defeat the desires of empire. That's really central to U.S. Law's mission, but it's also to help push the narrative along that really has become abundantly clear to me since I've been here. Most folks outside of the U.S., particularly outside of the U.S. labor movement, have the idea that workers are willingly complicit in the development of weapons of war, and the reality is that that's actually pretty far from the truth. Our organization has spent the last year working with workers who are organizing within, who are a part of the military-industrial complex and make weapons. And what we've learned is that the situation is much more complex. And the way I've tried to put it here is that I want people to imagine a burning house with folks trapped inside. The workers who make weapons of war don't really want to make those things. There are things in their communities that they need and that they value, that they'd like to produce, but because of the dictates of capital and because of the desires of people with plenty of money and not much sense, we have an issue where political dollars end up overwhelming those folks who want to see something different from their communities, and so those workers are left with a choice. We can either support militarism, or we can go broke. We can be poor. And the politicians are left in a similar boat because those political dollars that they end up accepting often make them feel like their hands are tied. That is a more complex and critical question that we can get into about the complicity of politicians. But the fact remains that in the end, there's a real challenge here that has to be faced, and the challenge can be met by workers organizing together. So what's really key and what's critical for us is expressing the solidarity of those workers here and forming a tighter bond so that we can figure out a way to set those workers free from that burning house, and so that we can all live in a world without weapons, and we can get the things that we need in our communities. So I'm really excited to be a part of this delegation. It's been a great couple of days, and I'm looking forward to future meetings with members of the labor community. So thanks so much for your support, and maybe we'll have an opportunity to talk about these things again soon.
Thanks so much to Reese, and hope to hear more of the voice of labor that Reese is bringing to the peace movement. It's been really exciting just being in conversation with him here. There's a very strong voice of labor here in South Korea, which is one of the really amazing things about this trip, is to see what a real labor movement is doing, and all sorts of discussion that we could have about that, about how and why it is that in a country that's been actually extremely repressive and conservative, that the labor movement in many ways is flourishing and played such a big part in the recent revolution, the so-called Candlelight Revolution, that took place here just a few months ago in South Korea, where their corrupt conservative president, President Park, was impeached on account of corruption. And what I've heard people say here, confirming my own thought, that her corruption is just a drop in the bucket compared to just the financial and other kinds of corruption that Donald Trump is involved in. So hopefully we'll follow in the footsteps of South Korea on that one, as well as in learning some things about the labor movement here. So with that, we're going to turn this over to Wol-san Lim, who is, as I mentioned before, part of the Korean Confederation of Trade Unions, which has been doing such exciting work, and she's really kind of been our major host here in South Korea. So I'm going to pass this back to Wol-san.
Yes. Hi, hello from South Korea, from a car coming up from Seongju to Seoul after the Peace Solidarity delegation has been in Seongju supporting the struggle of residents in that area who are fighting the deployment of THAAD in their village, which is threatening is disrupting everyday life in a really considerable way. I will start and introduce myself again. So my name is Wol-san Lim, and I'm the Director of International and Korea Peninsula Affairs for the Korean Public Service and Transport Workers Union, which is the largest affiliate of our national center, the Korean Confederation of Trade Unions. And I am in charge of both anti-war work and international work for our union, but our national center is part of a coalition which has come together to fight the deployment of THAAD in South Korea, and so in that capacity I've taken some time off from my regular union work to help coordinate the delegation from the Korea end, and I also played a little bit of a role unofficially consulting with Stick on the task force in the U.S. on putting the delegation together. And I'll talk a little bit about what we've done since the delegation arrived last Sunday. And so it's been a really, really full schedule, and there's a day and a half or almost 2 days left. So I think everybody's going to be pretty tired by the time they go home. But we started by meeting with the Shim Jae-kwon, who is the National Assembly member, our National Assembly representative, who's head of the Committee for Foreign Affairs and Reunification in the National Assembly, which is like the South Korean Congress. And it was a really good opportunity for the delegation to let politicians here know that not everybody, the United States, there are people in the United States that oppose the deployment of the THAAD missile system to South Korea, and that there is both an impact of that system not only in South Korea but on people in the United States, in the sense that the amount of money being diverted away from public services and addressing human needs to the creation of weapon systems like this is tremendous, and so actually a threat to lives here in Korea and in the United States. And we've gone on from then to do meetings with organizations here, including a strategic discussion with the Anti-THAAD Coalition here, and also to have a press conference and lots of press interviews. And so the response to the delegation by the press has been quite amazing. We've got a lot of reporting in major newspapers as well as progressive press. And most importantly, we've spent 2 days in the Seongju area, where in both the Sosongni village, which is right where the THAAD is being deployed, and in Kimcheon, which is directly above the THAAD radar, and so will be most impacted by the radar. And the delegation did a lot to give strength to the residents and there's a Buddhist group in the area, so to the residents and the Buddhists who are fighting the deployment, and in particular to let people know that just because it's the U.S. government that is deploying the THAAD and trampling on the sovereignty of people here, that is not representative of everybody in the United States, and in fact there is a voice supporting the struggle here and a voice against that in the United States, and there's a lot of avenues for solidarity, and so I think that message has been really important for people here to hear, and to help people separate the idea of the United States government and capital from the idea of the working class and people, regular people in the United States. And we are now going up to Seoul, where we will have more press interviews and also go on to meet with the Korean Confederation of Trade Unions and student groups here to have a little bit broader of a discussion, not only about THAAD and how we can achieve the withdrawal of THAAD from South Korea, but more broadly about social movements and how we're building social movements and connecting social movements here in Korea and in the United States. So we want to talk specifically about the role of the labor movement in anti-militarism struggles, and hear about also, particularly from Reese, who just spoke, about what U.S. Labor Against the War is doing in the United States in the afternoon here today. And I think that there's going to be some really great outcomes of the delegation, both in terms of coming up with some concrete things about what we can do to help expand the struggle against the deployment of THAAD in Korea and everywhere, and also start to talk about more long-term how we can have strategic discussions and exchanges between people, workers and common people in the U.S. and South Korea in this time of crisis, so a time of long-standing militarism and also the destabilization of the political hegemony of neoliberalism, and how we can use this as an opportunity to, as Jill said earlier, connect movements and create a strategy of resistance that hopefully builds on and expands and radicalizes the candlelight uprising, that the spirit of the candlelight uprising that took place here and helped us overthrow a very corrupt government, but hopefully it will help us also think about what real systemic change means, both in Korea and in the United States and around the world. So I'm very thankful to the delegates for dealing with such a rough schedule here, and hope that we can work together more in the future. And I think that, I know that we will. Jill.
Thank you so much, Will-san. It's really great to hear the wonderful perspective of labor, as well as just your facilitation that has made all these really amazing things happen. And I have to say, I've been blown away at the incredibly warm, welcoming reception that we've gotten from the Korean people, especially from the people who are fighting the U.S. missile system, and also from the press. I've been really amazed, including the conservative press, that's been really interested in our perspective and what they haven't been able to hear, especially about THAAD, and the fact that some of the major scientists who've designed these missile systems say that they totally don't work, or shall I say they study them. Theodore Postel, for example, the professor, I guess he's like an aerospace physics professor at MIT, who's really considered the leading authority on that, if you're doing a test and you only have one incoming missile and no obstacles, and the reception's really good, maybe there's a chance that it will hit it, but actually under real conditions where there are lots of missiles, you don't know the angle that they're going to be coming in from, and there are decoys and things like that, it doesn't work at all. So this is a missile system that actually endangers the people of South Korea. It creates a target and it destabilizes this very dangerous balance of power and nuclear weapons in the region. And it does that without having protected people, essentially. So even the conservative press is very interested to hear our perspective. I'm going to, in the interest of time, we're going to focus now on one question in particular from Brian Scully. no, actually, this wasn't from Brian. Brian observed that we either clean up our mess or the global community will pay the consequences. And I just want to really agree with that perspective. So many of you have been writing really great and supportive comments. Maybe we'll get to them on a later broadcast. But right now, I want to ask Will to take the first crack at this question of how do we educate and inform the American public about really critical issues here that are going to affect us all. And that includes the issue of THAAD, this so-called defensive missile system, and about why the war games are so dangerous. So I'm going to turn that over first to Will and then to Medea, who's doing a really interesting project that she'll tell you about that get at this question. And I think it's a question for all of you who are listening too, is how can you be involved to help get this out? Because what happens on the Korean Peninsula is, it's critical. We are at probably greater risk than at any time since the Cold War, at greater risk of a nuclear confrontation. If there is a war that's going to happen on the Korean Peninsula, it will be very difficult for that not to be a nuclear exchange of weapons, which will be devastating and which will have a catastrophic impact on the future. So it's really important that we all be involved now in a way that can really force the U.S. to do the right thing. It's as simple as a peace treaty. It says, which, what is it, 50 years later, 70 years later? How many years later is it? It's a long time later. There needs to be a peace treaty and not just an armistice, which could dissolve at any time. So there needs to be a peace treaty. We need to stop the war games. We need to take down THAAD, and in exchange, North Korea and Russia and China have all said that North Korea will freeze its nuclear weapons and its missile program. So we can solve this if the U.S. does what really needs to be done in any event. So passing it over to Will for his...
Thank you,
take it
Jill.
from there. Thank you.
Yeah, so I will talk about two things. One, with a particular focus on THAAD, but also a broad focus of how THAAD actually symbolizes a broad issue. And let's start with smashing the argument of people saying, well, why are we in Korea? We should focus on issues in America. Well, this has everything to do with Americans. We have a bloated military budget, right, that could be used in building our infrastructure, providing jobs, changing our energy sources, and so on. So many, helping veterans such as me, right? So many things, but it's going in the military defense budget, and the defense budget is being spent on things like this THAAD missile defense system. And a lot of people don't know, in South Korea, the U.S. has 83 military bases here, along with almost 30,000 troops, along with the THAAD missile system, PAC-3 missiles, SM-3 missiles, and everything in between. And we need to educate people on just the issues that's going on here. One of the ways we can educate people is come to Korea. And when and there's been several people from South Korea have come to the United States to do speaking tours and participate in marches and protests and rallies. Go see them, go talk to them, and build solidarity with them, right? Donald Trump isn't listening to us in America. Moon Jae-in isn't necessarily listening to the South Korean people, but we can listen to each other, right? And that's how we overcome these types of conflict. We build solidarity with each other. So back to the THAAD issue. THAAD symbolizes the issues on the Korean Peninsula, where the U.S. has overwhelming influence on South Korea. Basically, if the U.S. wants something done, the South Korean government will abide by it, essentially, right? So if the U.S. wants a THAAD system here, the South Korean government says, okay, we'll put it here, no problem. And that's a huge problem. So we need to understand and educate people on the influence that the U.S. has on the South Korean government, because, of course, if we want freedom and democracy, especially for our allies and comrades in South Korea, they need to make their own decisions. And it's incredibly difficult for them to do that when you have a large U.S. military population and influence over the country. And more broadly speaking, back to the defense budget, the spending, almost $1 trillion goes into military industrial complex a year. And this is money. If we want to fix the water in Flint, if we want to get rid of the Dakota Access pipelines in the country, if we want to provide jobs and health care for everyone and proper education, we're going to have to stop spending so much on the military defense budget, which goes into places like into the backyards of the farmers of Songju, where this THAAD missile defense system is going, and along with the other 83 bases all over the country, and the war games that go on every year. That's just what we're going to have to do. So build solidarity with people, educate people, and travel and learn and have a good time and eat some Korean food while you're at it.
Awesome. I'm going to pass this over to Medea in a second. I just want to add that as our networks and our movements come together, across the issues of peace, social, economic, and racial justice, anti-oppression work, anti-militarism, anti-imperialism, I have to say that the glue so much seems to be the frontline communities and their struggle and the human face of their struggle, the story of their struggle is so critical. And in our follow-up, I really hope to see those faces emerging as the spokespeople for these struggles and for the unity and the convergence of these struggles. Because once we start putting together the Standing Rocks and the Flint, Michigans, and the Jeju Islands, and the Gimcheon and Sonju villagers resisting THAAD, these are really the same issues of democracy, justice, and human rights that are leading the way forward. And I really look forward to our building a strong coalition around that. And last comment is just that there's a political dimension to this too, and that as we educate each other, taking clear political positions, which the Green Party does as the only national scale political party that's not funded by the weapons industry and the fossil fuel giants and war profiteers and the predatory banks, that we have the unique ability to really stand up and tell it like it is and fight it like it is. So just encouraging people to be a part of your green struggles and support your local green candidates who are often taking local positions on these issues as well. So with that, I'm going to pass it over to Medea, and then we'll hear from Reese as well, and then we'll close it out from there. Take it.
So one idea that occurred to us when we were in the lovely village of Sonju is how this very peaceful, traditional farming village that's known for its delicious melons has become the site of an unwanted U.S. weapons system. And we talked to a number of the women, both the elders in the village, who are some of the most active, feisty protesters you could ever imagine, who've been on this for about a year now. And we asked them to address the one company that really is profiting from this, and that is Lockheed Martin. It's a system developed by Lockheed Martin, and the CEO of Lockheed Martin is Marilyn Hewson, who not only is one of the few CEOs of a weapons company, but she fashions herself as a wonderful role model for women, as a mother, as an upstanding member of her community. So we asked the women in Sonju to send a message directly to Marilyn Hewson, and we got some wonderful responses that we'll be putting out in video form through Green Party channels, Code Pink, the STIC, Stop THAAD in Korea group, and we hope that you'll help us pass them around and join us in sending our messages to the CEO of Lockheed Martin to tell her that we don't think her weapons are making the world any better. Just the contrary. And then one more thing is that we are launching a campaign to divest from the weapons industry, and it's about time that we worked with universities, pension funds, with religious institutions to get them to take their money out of the weapons manufacturers, the war profiteers. And so we look forward to working with the Green Party on this. We're launching it in October in a summit in Washington, D.C. that we hope some of you might be able to join us at. But it'll be a long-term campaign, and we need everybody's support. And that's one way to say that THAAD missiles and other weapon systems are not something that we want to have our pensions invested in, our schools invested in, or our faith-based institutions invested in. So thank you so much.
Thank you, Missy. Awesome as usual. We're going to pass this over now to Rhys Chenault to tell us a little bit about his ongoing work to address this issue of how do we engage the American public, because this is not an issue that is independent of us. This has everything to do with U.S. policy and U.S. workers, in fact, and U.S. human beings, because if we allow this to reach its logical conclusion, which is nuclear confrontation, we're all going to pay an unspeakable price. So passing this on to Rhys so he can describe the amazing work that he's doing.
Hello again. So I'll be fairly brief. Like I mentioned before, U.S. Labor Against the War is currently trying to really figure out how to connect with folks who are seemingly locked into the military-industrial complex, and we're trying to do that without any real assumptions about who those people are or what their situation is like. We just want to approach it with solidarity and with a sense of realism, and part of that has been really introducing people to the idea that the things that we make are directly connected to how we present ourselves to the rest of the world. Often at times when we talk about workers, we talk about them in the abstract as a block of people that are to be moved around the board like chess pieces, and the reality couldn't be farther from the truth. As the son of a working parent and the spouse of a working union member, I often am forced to recognize that it's much more complicated than it's just a job that you put on and take off at the end of the day. It's about real people and real lives. So for us, this is a deeper exploration. We're prepared to take years to do this work and build these relationships. I invite other people to actually join us. I'm going to be traveling around the United States talking about my experiences in Korea. I'll make sure that you folks know where I'm going to be, and I'm going to do my best to try and find folks who are part of this overall challenge of demilitarizing our work and our production. And I want to make sure that folks are connected to each other and recognize each other, because I think that's where the real solidarity starts. I also want to make some opportunities for Korea trade union folks to be a part of the U.S. That's something we're going to have to work out after we leave here, but there's going to be multiple opportunities for people to engage on that level. And we've also got a blog that's from a labor perspective that I'll make sure folks are connected to. But overall, this is what the work is really about. It's not about trying to work from a place of abstractions, but from a place of justice. All right, thanks so much, folks.
Thank you, Rhys. Great words. Great words from Rhys Chenault, U.S. Labor Against the War. Another question came in, and let's see if I have it here. Let's see, I don't have it immediately, but the question was, how are you going to work with North Korea, given the difficulties, to put it mildly, of communicating with the leader of North Korea under our current relationship, which is horrible, to put it mildly. How are we going to work something out? So I'm going to pass this back to Walsan, because the Korean people are really a divided people, that is divided artificially into the North and South, and there are very strong feelings in South Korea about reestablishing relationships. So maybe Walsan can address this question. How do we work forward? How do we develop an agreement with North Korea, even if it's as simple as the peace treaty? Thank you.
I saw earlier that somebody had said, well, North Korea hasn't agreed to dialogue, hasn't listened to anything up to this point, and I just wanted to take a moment to point out that the reason that North Korea has not listened to anything that the United States or the previous South Korean government has said is because it's under incredible military pressure and economic pressure from the United States government and also through the United Nations. And I think it hasn't been made known to people in Korea that North Korea has made it quite clear that it is willing to have dialogue if the United States would stop threatening it in many ways. And I think that a lot of people don't realize the ways in which the United States continues to threaten the North Korean government and the North Korean state, and clearly also in the extent that there's military threat here, it's a threat to the North Korean people. And so we should be aware that the United States and South Korean militaries carry out at least twice a year joint military exercises now involving nuclear weapons that are directly aimed at training to invade and overthrow the North Korean government. And so the North Korean government has said several times that these war games it sees as an infringement on its sovereignty and a military threat, and it needs those to stop in order for it to sit down and have dialogue with the United States and South Korea and other parties in the region. The other thing is that the United States maintains a preemptive strike policy against the United States, and so that means that the United States has said that it's willing to, before North Korea uses nuclear weapons, make a preemptive strike on its nuclear facilities or other places in North Korea. That's obviously a direct threat to the people and government of North Korea. In addition, North Korea has now, unfortunately, accelerated the development of its nuclear weapons and its missile program, and it said it's not willing to give those up because it feels threatened in this way, but it has at times in the past stated that if those military games were stopped, the joint military exercises were stopped, if the United States stopped threatening it with the possibility of preemptive strike, with a generally hostile policy, and with its nuclear umbrella of protection over South Korea, in the sense that its willingness to use nuclear weapons against North Korea, then North Korea would be willing to at least freeze its development of nuclear weapons and missiles and sit down to have talks about moving towards, as Jill said earlier, a peace treaty to replace the armistice to end the Korean War. And we haven't brought the things. There are things that the United States can do to create the conditions for dialogue. Trump has said that the administration will dialogue if the conditions are right. Well, I think we need to go back to the United States government and say, you have a lot of things you need to do to create those conditions, and stop putting this only on North Korea for not listening to what the United States has to say. I'm not saying this to excuse North Korea. I don't think that any government should be developing nuclear weapons, but there's a lot more that we can do to stop escalating the tensions in the North Korean. There's a lot more that the United States can do to stop escalating the tensions on the peninsula and in the region, and that will be a first step towards getting dialogue towards what we all want, which is denuclearization of the peninsula and an ultimate abolition of nuclear weapons globally, and also for the Korean people, a peace treaty to end the Korean War.
Thank you so much. And I wanted Medea to be able to make a quick comment about working with governments that are characterized as being irrational and incapable of making deals.
Well, I would say that Iran would have been put in that same category and is still put in that same category by many people in the Trump administration. But the signature foreign policy achievement of Obama was the Iran nuclear deal, which was negotiated with other countries. And the U.S. under Trump has been reluctantly forced to acknowledge that Iran has abided by the deal. And so I think we should use that as an example of how to de-escalate tensions and how countries that are seen as, quote, irrational and not able to negotiate in good faith can really be brought to the table in serious discussions, and that's what we need to do in North Korea. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Medea. I'm going to pass it over to Will for another comment on this question of, how do we go forward with a deal that involves North Korea?
So, how do we deal with North Korea? Let's put this into perspective. The U.S. military has 83 bases in South Korea, 5 aircraft carriers in the Asia Pacific, 30,000 troops in the country, all types of missiles and military equipment, essentially surrounding North Korea. What if North Korea had 83 military bases in Mexico, 5 aircraft carriers surrounding the California coast, all types of missiles pointed at the U.S., and a nuclear first strike policy from Mexico towards the U.S.? How would the residents of San Diego or California feel being surrounded by a foreign military presence like that? How would the Pentagon react to such a thing? I think we all know how that would go. It would be devastating, and to think of North Korea acting so irrationally, you got to understand their perspective. They're still living with the consequences of the Korean War, where the U.S. completely destroyed and carpet bombed everything from communities to their dams to all of their infrastructure. It was just flattened out. And since 1953, the end of the Korean War, the U.S. has maintained this posture of threatening them with a nuclear first strike capability, not a retaliation strike, a first strike threat. So we need to recognize our own selves. And we had a comment earlier from Martin who said, what if Russia had bombed the U.S. because we were poisoning our own people in Flint? Think about that. That's literally U.S. policy around the world, is maintaining these threats against other countries and surrounding entire countries with our huge military presence. So let's think about that in context.
Awesome. So we're going to have to close it off. At this point, we went on much longer than we thought we would. Thank you all so much for tuning in, for being a part of this conversation, and for your incredibly thoughtful and inspiring comments, which we've been reading here as we've been going along. And consider this the beginning of this conversation, not the end. I really look forward to having each of the members of the delegation back on, able to talk longer about their work and more ongoing discussion among us all. So again, thank you all so much. Keep fighting the good fight. Forget the lesser evil, fight for the greater good, like our lives depend on it, because they do. We can create an America and a world that works for all of us, and the power to do that is in our hands. Thank you all so much. See you next week. Take care. Bye.